I want to tell you about a real member of my family, someone I've known my entire life. We'll call him John. John is currently in his 60s and retired from the blue-collar workforce. He's been a voting citizen planted firmly on the left side of the political spectrum for his entire life, and he's a believer in the importance of labor unions. He's never once voted for anyone outside of the Democratic Party as of the 2016 presidential election. John is a married man, and he and his wife believe strongly in equal rights across the gender spectrum, and he doesn't care which bathroom you use. He's also in favor of fully legalized medical and recreational marijuana, and he doesn't mind breaking the law to consume it in the meantime. He lives in a wooded area with something of a charming backwoods culture. His yard has an area for large bonfires where he sometimes sings ballads from the 60s and 70s while he plays his guitar. At first glance, if he wore a tie-dyed shirt and had longer hair, you might take him for a pacifist hippie, but you'd be wrong. What you should also know about John is that he's a firm advocate for gun rights. He owns and hunts with several rifles, and he owns a handgun for home protection. John is also, by any reasonable standard, a racist. Despite being from and living in a northern state, he flies a Confederate flag in his yard, and holds the belief that in general, white people are better than black people. When pressed on the subject, he's happy to supply anecdotal evidence from some of the few black people with whom he's directly interacted who have mistreated other people around him. A bully at his son's school happened to be black, for example. But it gets more complicated than that. You see, John's wedding reception was held at his home, open to invitations only, where guests indulged themselves in food cooked in John's kitchen by he and his family, along with plenty of my family's favorite substance, alcohol, flowing freely. And at John's invitation-only wedding reception, beneath the modern Star-Spangled Banner and the Confederate stars and bars, were several black people. I witnessed black Americans shake his hand, hug his new wife, eat his food, and drink his beer. Now, what the hell kind of riddle within a puzzle wrapped in an enigma do we have going on here? Well, in the same way that a highly intelligent scientist can also be a Christian who passively accepts the outlandish biblical claims without applying the scientific method to the basic standards of evidence that he or she would with anything outside of faith, mental gymnastics can occur all over the brain, in people all over the world. John was raised by racist parents in an era with limited exposure to people outside of his own ethnicity. It made it easy to allow what he took in from popular culture and media representation to confirm his backwoods biases, enough for him to conclude that overall white people like him are good and black people are generally bad. Meanwhile, even though he actually likes the majority of the black people he's gotten to know personally, that number is relatively small, and he considers them to be the exception to the rule, whereas those he encounters with negative experiences confirm the rule. Here's the kicker, though. Just like most of John's side of the family is populated by alcoholics, most of them have the same approach to casual racism as John. I'd like to add that even though he's technically a gun owner and a big-time proponent of the Second Amendment, John's not a member of the NRA. Likewise, even though he's ideologically a basic racist, he's not a member of the KKK. I'm telling you about John and some of my other family members because I don't believe people give enough consideration to how complex human beings happen to be. We tend to understand how complex our own minds are, and most of us who bother with hard introspection realize that we have our own contradictions, hypocrisies, biases, and uncertainties with which to grapple. We know that we're much more than a collection of simple labels, let alone one single label. We understand that our own positions exist on a spectrum rather than a switch. It seems that in a modern landscape of discussion, especially across message boards and social media platforms, that we are typically reluctant to view other people with anywhere near the nuance that we grant ourselves and our dearest friends and family. Worse still, I've seen this spill over into reality more and more over the last 5 to 10 years. Now, that's not to say it hasn't always been this bad. Maybe I'm just more aware of it now than I used to be, or that the internet has brought out the worst of this and put that behavior on full display. At any rate, there's a deep lack of compassion for those with whom we disagree. Now, this happens on both sides of pretty much any issue you can imagine, but I want to focus on how it's affected my side of the political aisle, which technically is the left, as in hard left-leaning, moderate, or independent. Like I said, the right does this just as much in its own ways. However, it's not only hypocritical to point out my neighbor's filthy house without cleaning my own, but worse yet, I have to live in my own house. I should be critical of the things that are wrong with it, and I should try to get everyone living here with me to do our part to straighten things up. I think it's a shame that I even have to explain that in an effort to keep people from dismissing this entire message by just pummeling me with far-right labels. Though, let's be honest, that'll probably still happen. You see, those associated with the general social positions of the modern-day left were on the correct side of history regarding some key issues. First-wave feminism, activism for civil rights equality, homosexual equality, and now the push to legalize marijuana and stop pumping prisons full of those who use a plant to commit a victimless crime. However, the left has basically won the culture war, while those on the right have either assimilated to those standards or dug their heels into the wrong side of history. On the basic level, this should be a victory for the left, but many of us have refused to take the high road, and we've become counterproductively complacent instead. This is a real shame, because the left is supposed to be the compassionate side that looks out for people, cares for them, and fights to preserve our humanity through anything else that we do. But it seems that more and more, the loudest of the left at least, are only compassionate for those that they consider to be far enough on the left to deserve it. It seems that many of us on the modern left have lost the willingness to argue. It's disturbing how often I've heard a fellow liberal insist something like, it's not my job to explain why you're a misogynist. Of course, it's not those people's jobs to insult other people or throw labels at them either, but they don't mind taking on that duty with zealous enthusiasm. If you're claiming that someone is a racist, misogynist, Nazi, homophobe, Islamophobe, and that person disagrees with you, the burden of proof lies on you to support your assertion, preferably with sound and reasonable solutions and alternatives that you'd like to see for their behavior. Now, you don't have to engage and actually give some compassionate and measured conversation with these people, but realize that if all you do is scream insults at somebody, it will almost certainly serve only to enrage that person and drive him or her farther from your cause. After all, if you call a man a thief, treat him like a thief, attempt to punish him for being a thief, and constantly insult him for being a thief, even if he isn't really a thief, you can't be too shocked if at some point he says, well, shit, I might as well steal something. In their zealous quest to seek and destroy that which does not fit their version of social utopia, I've watched my fellow liberals completely ignore the above-mentioned spectrum of positions, let alone the fact that every human being has thousands of places each may fall upon the spectrums of multiple issues, not just one. Instead of considering people as complex individuals with nuanced opinions and beliefs, if they find out that just one position of someone isn't far left enough, they're prepared to write that person off as a Nazi. You voted for Donald Trump? You must be a Nazi. You say the words America first? Nazi. You have a Confederate flag patch on your jacket? You must belong to the KKK. You don't like to label yourself as a feminist, even though you do support the positions of its technical definition? Well, then you're a pig-headed, woman-hating fascist. That isn't my idea of demonstrating that you're a member of a compassionate party that cares about people. It's no better than when people on the right show boundless compassion for unwanted fetuses, then treat them as if they're warts on the hide of society once they become impoverished babies. Hopefully my anecdotal example of John and the note that he's not all that unique, even just within my own family, let alone all of humankind, helps to demonstrate that there's a lot more to a person than just a stance or opinion on one or two issues, or where they fall on those spectrums. Now, if you're not interested in making actual progress with your progressive agenda, then none of this really matters. You don't need to bother getting to know people before you drench them in toxic labels and stockpile them with ammunition to hate liberals. Of course, I'm not sure what you're hoping to accomplish or what pleasure you gain from driving people away from your own beliefs, but you do have the right to do so. I just want you to realize that's what you're doing in case you're interested in making genuine progress. If you haven't seen it yet, whether you lean left or right, I wish to sincerely recommend that you watch the documentary called Accidental Courtesy. It's on Netflix, and I'll link to its website below. It's about a black American man named Daryl Davis who has spent years speaking with and changing the hearts and minds of KKK members, including their leaders. Because Daryl is willing to listen to these people and show them genuine compassion, they miraculously are willing to listen to him too. Over time, it turns out that good ideas often triumph over bad ideas, but the people with faulty ideas have no reason to listen to dissenters who just scream at them about how evil they are, or tell them to shut up and check their male, white, cisgender Nazi privilege, instead of creating a space of mutual respect where both mindsets can be shared and fairly discussed. Sadly, the film also features what I consider to be its most poignant scene, wherein Daryl sits down to speak with a few people in Ferguson, Missouri. He first has a calm and measured conversation with a racist white man. He then attempts to speak with two black activists from Ferguson. Mind you, Daryl has converted leaders of the KKK to leave their racist hate group, in some cases dismantling their chapters, and to give a black man their ceremonial robes. However, these black activists in Ferguson painfully insist that Daryl's not helping the black cause, and if he really wanted to help, then he should instead be with them protesting police in Ferguson. The black protesters were so outraged with Daryl's willingness to genuinely reach out to the opposition in an effort to change their minds that after a short time, they refused to sit at the table and walked out on the conversation. This is the kind of evidence I see of the modern left going off the rails and doing a colossal amount of self-harm when they think they're somehow helping. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with peacefully protesting grievances with authority, but displaying your anger and doing something about the problem are not the same thing, nor are they mutually exclusive. The real problem here is that we've lost the will to have the arguments and explain why something like a racist position is horrible, because it's easier to just accuse someone of being a racist, demonizing the person, and concluding that they are therefore horrible and insulting them with no effort to sway them. One of the most common counterclaims that I hear is that responding to and or interacting with crazy or harmful ideas gives them a platform to spread. That makes no sense to me. If you encounter someone who you truly consider to be a Nazi, ignoring that person has zero chance of changing his or her mind. I would argue that it normalizes their behavior if people don't bother to respond. Insulting him or her will do nothing but harden the resolve of the position which you oppose. But engaging that person, listening to the opposite opinions and addressing them with superior ideas and counterpoints actually has a good chance of at least planting seeds of doubt about those harmful positions. And who knows, maybe you learn something about the other side that you didn't realize. Maybe you understand them better and improve your ability to argue those points, or improve your ability to empathize with them, giving them some kind of ground to empathize with the causes that you champion. This is how we should be working things out in a growing society, rather than retreating into our tribes. Now, you're under no obligation to engage someone. Debate isn't for everyone, and if you run into a debate with someone who is very familiar with talking points and you don't have much experience or understanding of rhetoric, you can make your position look worse. Of course, that's only giving a platform if you're doing this publicly. Otherwise, you're safe to refine your own positions and practice the art of conveying them if you're willing to engage your opposition in a civil, private conversation. Chances are they aren't actually the fire-breathing neo-Nazis you might think they are just because they have Trump signs in their yards or refuse to call themselves feminists. If you bothered to talk with a man like John, you'd probably realize that you two actually had a lot in common to share, and you probably could have worked out a better understanding of each other if you bothered to listen to each other. If you'd each practice a little empathy and compassion for each other. Even if you choose not to engage dissenters in civil discourse, remember that there are level-headed left-leaners out here actually trying to reach people. And when you run around screaming at or advocating for violence against those who oppose you, you make it so much harder for those of us actually attempting to change hearts and minds. Just think about how many times in your life someone has actually changed your mind about something. Then think, out of those times, how often was your mind changed by someone screaming a label at you and telling you to shut up? I leave you with the following action and consequence analysis for your consideration. So, let's say your approach is dismissing someone or screaming at them by calling him or her a Nazi. Now, in this version, that person really is a Nazi. The result is that you just called them what they already know they are. This is as useful as you yelling to a woman, "You're a woman!" It does nothing to change the person's mind or improve the situation. So essentially you wind up neutral. You did nothing. Now let's imagine the exact same approach, but this time the person is not a Nazi, but they do disagree with your position on the left. Now, in this case, the result is that you unfairly and inaccurately threw an insulting, horrific label at someone. The person knows it is inaccurate and that you didn't bother to learn his or her real position because it was easier for you to use straw men and ad hominems than to have any real discourse. You run the strong risk of driving them away from your position because you were unreasonable to them. I would call that a negative outcome. Now let's say your approach is listening to the person's reasons for being what you assume to be a Nazi and having an open dialogue with them. Now again, that's your approach, and the situation is this time the person again is really a Nazi. When you approach this way, you get to learn about the reason behind the Nazi's position and actually address their points. You have an opportunity to plant seeds of doubt in his or her mind, and you've given that person a reason to listen to you because you've listened to him or her. Now, the exact same approach. This time, let's say the person isn't a Nazi, but you approached by listening to the person's reason for being what you assume to be a Nazi and having that open dialogue. Now, in this case, you get to learn the person's actual position. Instead of just calling them what you assume it is, you had a conversation and you learn what their actual position is. And you earn their ears so you can share your position with him or her. You open the floodgates of communication and you start to learn from each other. If your ideas are better and you're both willing to listen, your ideas triumph. You win someone over to your side of the issue rather than pushing them away. I would say that's a positive outcome.